Have you ever watched an entire room change just because one person walked in? That night, the city's most elegant restaurant seemed to breathe fear. The gentle clinking of silverware was hushed, almost timid, and conversations were reduced to whispers. Golden light spilled from the chandeliers, dancing on crystal glasses, while the warm aroma of freshly baked bread mingled with the faint trace of expensive cologne drifting from the center table. There he was, Richard Blackwell, a corporate mogul known for turning meetings into battlegrounds and words into weapons. A man used to commanding an entire room with nothing more than a glance. But weaving between balanced trays and hurried footsteps was a new waitress. Her heart raced, but her eyes carried something no one there had seen before: courage. Perhaps it was because she knew firsthand what it meant to face hard days without losing her dignity. Or perhaps it was because she clung to the words hidden deep in her heart. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" Psalm 27:1. When Richard Blackwell motioned for her to come closer, the entire room froze. It was as if every guest, every staff member held their breath, silently wishing they could shield her from whatever was about to happen. But she didn't step back. She didn't lower her gaze. And in that moment, no one knew. Something was about to happen that would make this night unforgettable. And have you ever stood your ground against someone everyone else feared? If this story speaks to your heart, subscribe and share your own experience in the comments, because sometimes the greatest strength lies in those the world underestimates. The rain had been steady all evening, tapping against the tall glass windows in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Inside, the restaurant glowed with a warm amber light, but that warmth did little to reach the table where Richard Blackwell sat. His presence was a storm of its own. Tailored charcoal suit, gold cufflinks catching the light, eyes scanning the room like a king inspecting his court. Around him, conversations dipped even lower, as if afraid to disturb the air he occupied. From the corner, the new waitress adjusted the tray in her hands, her palms slick with nervous sweat. She'd only been working here for 2 weeks, but she'd already heard the stories. The temper, the impossible demands, the way his words could cut sharper than the knives laid on the tables. Still, something in her heart whispered not to shrink back tonight. She breathed in deeply, catching the scent of rosemary bread and roasted garlic as she approached his table. "Water," Richard said without looking up, his tone clipped, cold. His eyes remained fixed on the documents spread before him. Contracts, numbers, the empire he commanded. She set the glass down carefully, but his gaze finally lifted, narrowing as it landed on the smallest detail. The coaster wasn't perfectly aligned with the edge of the table. "Do it again," he said flatly. No raised voice, no theatrics, but the weight of the words was enough to draw glances from nearby diners. She felt the burn of their pity, the silent warnings in their eyes. Her fingers trembled as she adjusted the glass, but inside, another voice rose, steady, unshaken. "Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you," she remembered from Jeremiah 1:8. The verse seemed to wrap around her like a shield. When she stepped back, his eyes lingered on her face. Something in her calm unsettled him, though he didn't say a word. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. The moment passed, but the air between them felt charged, as if the real exchange hadn't even begun. And in the quiet hum of the restaurant, the question hung unspoken. How far would Richard Blackwell push? And how far would she go before pushing back? The dinner rush had transformed the restaurant into a living, breathing organism, a symphony of movement and sound. The warm, golden light from the chandeliers spilled across linen-draped tables, casting delicate shadows on the polished wood floors. The soft clinking of silverware blended with the murmur of conversations and the occasional burst of laughter from a corner booth. Yet, in the midst of the evening's vibrancy, there was a subtle current, of unease. Staff members moved briskly but cautiously, their eyes flicking toward the corner table where Richard Blackwell sat like a king surveying his domain. He had a way of making his presence felt without a single word, the way his gaze lingered, the deliberate precision of his gestures, the quiet authority that wrapped itself around the air. Tonight, his attention had found a new target. The young waitress weaving between tables, her tray balanced with practiced care despite the beads of sweat forming along her hairline. As she approached his table, her senses seemed to heighten. She noticed the faint scent of his cologne, something dark and expensive, layered with notes of leather and cedar. She heard the rhythmic tapping of his pen against a leather-bound notebook, a sound that seemed louder than the rest of the room. When she stopped before him, he didn't look up immediately. Instead, he allowed the silence to stretch, creating a pocket of tension so dense it felt like everyone nearby could sense it. Finally, his eyes lifted, sharp and assessing. "You're new," he said, his tone carrying the weight of a man used to having his observations treated as fact. "Yes, sir," she replied, steadying her voice. His lips curled into a faint smirk. "Let's see if you last longer than the last one." The comment wasn't shouted, but it didn't need to be. The volume was perfectly calibrated to carry to the nearest tables. The sting was immediate, but she refused to let it seep into her expression. "I'm here to serve, Mr. Blackwell," she answered, her tone calm yet firm. "And I intend to do it well." Her words hung between them. Not aggressive, but unshakable. A flicker of surprise passed through his eyes before he masked it beneath his usual composure. She set the water glass on the table, aligning it with care, though his gaze shifted to the coaster. "Do it again," he instructed flatly, the corners of his mouth barely moving. It was a command dressed in civility, but heavy with condescension. Nearby, a couple pretended to study their menus while watching from the corners of their eyes. The waitress adjusted the glass without haste, feeling her heartbeat steady under the weight of his stare. Inside, she called upon the verse she'd read that very morning. "A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." Proverbs 15:1. The words wrapped around her like armor, grounding her in the face of his quiet challenge. She stepped back, meeting his gaze without flinching. For a moment, it seemed as if the noise of the restaurant faded, leaving only the two of them locked in a silent test of wills. Then, without breaking eye contact, Richard gave a small nod, barely perceptible, and returned his attention to his notebook, dismissing her as if the exchange had been nothing more than routine. But the air between them told another story. As she retreated toward the kitchen, she felt the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had not only survived her first direct encounter with Richard Blackwell, but she had done so without lowering her eyes, without letting his words chip away at her dignity. Still, she knew this was no victory. Not yet. The way he had studied her, the way his smirk had faded for just an instant, told her that he had noticed something he wasn't expecting. And in that realization came a truth she couldn't ignore. The real battle hadn't even begun. The hum of the restaurant softened as the late-night crowd began to thin. But in the kitchen, the energy remained taut. Stainless steel counters gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights, and the air was thick with the lingering scent of roasted garlic and charred rosemary. The waitress slipped past a line cook carrying a tray of creme brulee, her mind still replaying the exchange with Richard Blackwell. She could feel the residual weight of his stare, the way his words had been sharp enough to draw blood without ever raising his voice. She set her tray down, trying to focus on the rhythm of service. But the kitchen had a language of its own, and tonight, that language was whisper. Two busboys leaned against the far counter, their voices low. "You shouldn't have looked him in the eye like that," one murmured, eyes darting toward the doorway. He doesn't forget things like that. The other nodded, his tone laced with something between fear and respect. Last guy who did, well, he's not working here anymore. She pretended not to hear, but every word slipped under her skin. In a place where fear was currency, challenging Richard Blackwell, even subtly, was the kind of thing that drew notice, and she had no doubt he'd noticed. Stepping into the narrow staff corridor, she caught fragments of another conversation, this one quieter, more deliberate. The maitre d', an older man with salt and pepper hair and a posture carved from decades in fine dining, was speaking to the head chef. "Blackwell's here again. Alone. Same table. You know what that means." The chef grunted, flipping a pan with a practiced motion. "He's hunting for weakness. Always is." The words painted an image she didn't want to dwell on. Not a man simply eating dinner, but a predator testing the edges of the herd. Back at the service station, she rested her hands against the cool marble countertop, drawing in a deep breath. "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you." Deuteronomy 31:6. The verse surfaced unbidden, like a lifeline thrown into turbulent waters. It steadied her pulse, softened the tension in her shoulders. Fear might have been the currency here, but she refused to spend it. Yet, as she re-entered the dining room, she caught sight of Richard's table, empty, save for a single glass of water and a folded napkin, and in the space he'd left behind was something else. The faint scent of his cologne still lingering in the air, as if to remind her that his absence was only temporary. Somewhere deep down, she knew the whispers were right about one thing. Richard Blackwell didn't forget, and that meant the next move would be his. The following evening, the city's skyline glimmered beyond the restaurant's tall windows, skyscraper lights flickering like a constellation built from steel and ambition. Inside, the atmosphere was polished to perfection. Candles flickered on each table, casting soft halos on white linen, while the low murmur of conversation mingled with the faint strains of a live piano. Yet beneath the elegance, there was a taut undercurrent, a quiet anticipation. And at the center of it, as always, sat Richard Blackwell, his dark suit absorbing the warm glow like a shadow that could not be softened. She noticed him the moment she stepped onto the floor, balancing a tray laden with steaming plates. Her shift had barely begun, but already her chest tightened. Tonight felt different, charged somehow. Richard's gaze found her almost immediately, and with a subtle motion of his hand, he summoned her. As she approached, she could feel the eyes of other staff trailing her path. A folded slip of paper lay on his table beside a half-empty glass of Bordeaux. Without preamble, he gestured toward a private dining area at the far end of the room. "Take the mayor's table," he said, voice even but firm. "They've been waiting too long." It was an impossible request. The mayor's party had arrived unannounced, their dishes requiring intricate preparation. She opened her mouth to explain, but his gaze warned her that any hesitation would be a mistake. "Of course, sir," she replied, her tone steady. She pivoted toward the kitchen, feeling the seconds tick against her like drops of rain on glass. Inside, the heat was oppressive, chefs calling out orders in rapid succession. The head chef frowned when she relayed the demand. "Tell Blackwell it's not possible," he said, slamming a pan onto the burner. But that wasn't an option she was willing to take back. She rolled up her sleeves and began helping plate other orders, clearing a path for the mayor's courses. It was a dance of urgency, her hands moving quickly but precisely, the scent of sizzling butter and garlic clinging to her uniform. Her mind clung to the quiet assurance of Isaiah 41:10. "Do not fear, for I am with you. I will strengthen you and help you." The verse wove through her thoughts like a steady heartbeat, keeping panic at bay. When she finally emerged from the kitchen, the tray for the mayor's table gleamed, polished silver domes catching the candlelight as she carried them with careful grace. Richard watched her from across the room, his expression unreadable. She delivered the plates with a smile, earning a nod of appreciation from the mayor himself. As she turned to leave, she caught the faintest shift in Richard's posture, not approval, but acknowledgement. Yet she knew it wasn't the end of the test. If anything, it was a sign that the game had only deepened, and as the night wore on, she couldn't shake the certainty that Richard Blackwell wasn't just measuring her skill, he was measuring her resolve. The next challenge, she suspected, would cut even closer to the bone. The night after the mayor's dinner, the restaurant felt unusually calm. The hum of conversation was softer, the clinking of silverware more measured, as if the entire place had collectively exhaled after days of tension. The soft notes of a jazz piano floated through the air, mingling with the scent of freshly baked focaccia and the faint, sweet aroma of crème brûlée being caramelized in the kitchen. Yet for her, the sense of unease remained, not because Richard Blackwell was absent, but because he was there, seated alone in his usual corner, his eyes scanning the room like a man who saw everything and missed nothing. Her shift had been smooth until a small commotion erupted near the kitchen doors. One of the younger bussers, a boy barely 16, had tripped while carrying a tray of water glasses. Crystal shattered across the floor, the sound sharp and startling. The boy's face flushed deep red as he scrambled to collect the pieces. She didn't hesitate. Setting her own tray down, she knelt beside him, her hands quick and gentle as she helped gather the shards. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice low and calm. "Everyone makes mistakes." The boy looked at her, relief and gratitude in his eyes, the kind of look that didn't need words to be understood. From his table, Richard watched the entire scene unfold. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze lingered longer than usual. When she returned to her station, one of the other waiters leaned in and murmured, "Careful, Blackwell doesn't like distractions." She smiled faintly, shaking her head. Kindness isn't a distraction. The words were simple, but they carried weight, a truth she had learned long before she ever stepped foot in this restaurant. Minutes later, as she passed by his table, Richard spoke without looking up from his glass. "That boy will never make it in this business if you coddle him." His voice was smooth, but beneath it was the challenge she had come to expect. She paused, her hand lightly resting on the back of a chair. "Maybe not," she replied softly, "but he'll remember that someone believed in him." For a brief moment, his eyes met hers, and there was something there, something almost human, before he glanced away. She walked on, carrying plates to another table, but the moment stayed with her. It was small, subtle, but it had cracked something in the air between them. Perhaps Richard Blackwell wasn't entirely made of steel. Perhaps there was a door, locked, yes, but not impenetrable. Still, she knew better than to think a single glimpse of humanity would change everything. If anything, it only made the coming storm feel closer. The rain had returned, streaking the tall windows in silver lines as a storm brewed outside. Inside, the restaurant was a hive of activity, every table full, every seat taken. The air carried the rich scent of braised short ribs, mingled with the sharper notes of freshly ground pepper and the earthy aroma of truffle oil. But tonight was no ordinary service. The private dining room had been reserved for an exclusive gathering of the city's most influential figures, politicians, investors, and media personalities. It was the kind of night where perfection wasn't just expected, it was demanded. And at the center of it all, orchestrating the unspoken pressure, was Richard Blackwell. From the moment she stepped onto the floor, she could feel his eyes on her. The evening had been carefully choreographed, every course timed to the minute. She moved from table to table, the warm glow of the chandeliers catching on her polished serving trays. But as she approached the private room, Richard's voice cut through the air. "Miss!" he called, his tone as sharp as the click of his gold pen. "You'll be serving the head table tonight." Heads turned, and a murmur passed through the staff. It was an unspoken rule that only the most seasoned servers handled that responsibility. She didn't hesitate outwardly, though inside her pulse quickened. The head table was a gauntlet. Every guest, someone with the power to shape the city's future. Every move she made subject to scrutiny. As she stepped inside, she was met with a wall of polished smiles and expensive cologne. Crystal glasses gleamed under soft overhead lighting, and the table itself was a masterpiece of folded linen and fresh orchids. Richard sat just to the left of the host, his presence commanding without effort. Halfway through the main course service, the moment came. As she placed a plate before one of the guests, Richard spoke in a voice pitched just loud enough for the entire table to hear. "Careful, miss. We wouldn't want a repeat of last week's performance." The words hung in the air like smoke, curling into the ears of everyone present. The room went still for a heartbeat, and she felt the weight of a dozen eyes on her. But instead of flinching, she steadied her hands, adjusted the plate with precision, and looked him directly in the eye. Inside, she anchored herself with Psalm 46:5. God is within her, she will not fall. God will help her at break of day. The verse rose like a shield, its quiet power steadying her breathing. She gave a small, measured smile before moving on to the next guest, never breaking her rhythm. But the air between her and Richard had shifted. He'd expected hesitation. Instead, he'd been met with unshaken resolve. By the time the final dessert was served, she could feel the tension in the room like static before a storm. And as she left the private dining area, she caught the faintest trace of a smile on Richard Blackwell's face. Though whether it was approval or calculation, she couldn't tell. One thing was certain. The breaking point was near, and neither of them would walk away unchained. The next evening carried a rare stillness, the kind that feels like the pause before a conductor lifts the baton. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the streets slick and shimmering beneath the amber glow of streetlights. Inside, the restaurant was hushed but charged, every detail more deliberate. The low hum of conversation, the faint tinkling of ice in crystal glasses, the muted jazz curling softly from the piano in the corner. Richard Blackwell sat at his usual table, his dark suit pressed to perfection, his cufflinks catching the light with each subtle movement of his hands. But tonight, there was a sharpened edge to his posture, as if the last encounter had left him with something to settle. Her shift began smoothly, but midway through the evening, Richard raised his hand, not urgently, but with the unspoken expectation that she would drop everything and come. She approached, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest, though her steps remained even. He gestured toward a couple seated nearby. "They've been waiting too long for their entrees," he said, his tone deceptively mild. "Explain to them why." The request was a trap, one that would force her to either throw the kitchen under the bus or take the blame herself. She inhaled slowly, letting the scents of rosemary, seared salmon, and warm bread ground her senses. Then, with a calmness that felt borrowed from somewhere higher than herself, she turned to the guests. "I apologize for the delay," she said warmly. "We wanted to ensure your meals were perfect before they reached your table." The couple's faces softened, and they nodded in understanding. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, his challenge sidestepped but not ignored. As she turned back to him, her voice lowered just enough for only he to hear. "Sir, I believe in serving people, not just plates." And then, as if the words had been waiting for this exact moment, she added softly, "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters." Colossians 3:23. The verse hung in the air between them, weightless yet immovable. For the first time, Richard didn't reply immediately. His gaze held hers, something unreadable flickering in his expression. The silence stretched, not tense, but contemplative, as though she had handed him a truth he hadn't expected to carry. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, the faintest ghost of a smile touching his lips before he dismissed her with a quiet, "Very well." As she walked away, her pulse steadied, but she knew this wasn't the end. Richard Blackwell had heard her voice tonight, not just the words, but the conviction behind them. And convictions, she knew, had the power to change people, or to challenge them beyond what they were willing to face. The following night, the restaurant felt different, as if the air itself carried the residue of the previous evening. Conversations were softer, laughter less frequent, and even the staff moved with an unspoken caution. The golden glow of the chandeliers illuminated the polished silverware and crystal glasses, but beneath the beauty, there was a subtle heaviness. Richard Blackwell sat at his corner table, posture precise, his expression unreadable. Yet, there was something in the way his gaze followed her, less like a predator stalking and more like a man, observing. Her duties carried her through the dining room in steady patterns, the scents of roasted duck, citrus glaze, and freshly baked bread mingling in the air. She kept her focus on the service, but every so often she caught his eyes fixed on her, as if replaying the words she had spoken the night before. The other servers noticed it too. One brushed past her and whispered, "He's quieter tonight." It wasn't meant as comfort, more as a warning that the quiet could mean anything. Midway through the evening, a small accident broke the rhythm. A guest at a nearby table spilled a glass of wine, the deep red liquid blooming across the pristine tablecloth. She moved quickly, dabbing and replacing the linens with efficient grace, offering warm reassurances to the embarrassed guest. The moment was small, but as she looked up, she realized the restaurant had stilled, not entirely silent, but subdued, the kind of pause that happens when everyone notices a shift in the air. Richard's eyes were on her, unblinking. For several seconds, the sounds of clinking cutlery and murmured conversations seemed to fade, leaving only the quiet weight of that gaze. It wasn't the cold, assessing stare she'd grown accustomed to. There was something searching there, as if he were seeing her for the first time not as staff, but as something else. The stillness spread outward, guests glancing between them, sensing the tension though not understanding its depth. She felt the verse rise in her heart like a steady flame. "Let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." Matthew 5:16. It wasn't spoken aloud, but it seemed to pulse through her movements, in the way she folded the fresh linen, in the calmness of her smile. The room gradually returned to life, but the echo of that pause lingered. As she stepped into the kitchen, one of the line cooks caught her arm gently. "What happened out there?" he asked, curiosity in his eyes. She shook her head with a small smile. "Nothing, and everything." Because deep down, she knew the silence hadn't just been a lack of noise. It had been a moment of recognition, and recognition, she suspected, was the first step toward change. The night began like any other, the warm glow of chandeliers reflecting off crystal, the scent of rosemary bread drifting from the kitchen, the quiet hum of polished service. Yet there was a faint tension threaded through the air, a sense of anticipation that she couldn't quite name. Richard Blackwell was already seated at his usual table when she arrived, his tailored suit immaculate, his fingers lightly resting on a glass of Bordeaux. But tonight, there was something different in his demeanor, a watchfulness that wasn't quite predatory nor entirely casual. She moved through her duties with the same practiced rhythm, balancing trays, exchanging polite words with guests, adjusting linens with precision. Every so often she felt his gaze, steady and deliberate. It wasn't the kind of look meant to intimidate, but it carried weight nonetheless. Near the midpoint of the evening, as she passed by his table, he spoke her name for the first time. The sound of it on his lips startled her more than she expected. "When you finish here," he said quietly, "meet me in the lounge." It wasn't phrased as a request. The lounge was dimly lit, with deep leather chairs and the faint aroma of aged whiskey lingering in the air. The rain outside had returned, tapping against the tall windows like a soft, persistent drumbeat. She stepped inside cautiously, unsure of what awaited her. Richard sat near the fire, its glow flickering across his features, casting shadows that made him seem at once younger and more tired than she'd ever seen him. He gestured for her to sit. "You've been here how long?" he asked, his tone lacking the usual sharpness. "3 weeks," she replied. He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Most people don't last that long." There was no smirk this time, no edge, only a flat statement of fact. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the flames. Finally, he leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers. "Why didn't you fold the other night?" "Most do." Her answer came without hesitation. "Because my worth doesn't come from what happens here." She held his gaze, feeling the quiet strength of Isaiah 40:31 anchor her. "But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength." The words weren't spoken aloud, but they resonated through her posture, her calm. Richard didn't reply immediately. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, his expression unreadable. Then, in a tone that almost sounded like concession, he said, "I respect that." It was brief, understated, but for a man like Richard Blackwell, it might as well have been a confession. As she left the lounge, the rain had eased, and a cool breeze swept through the corridor. She didn't know what this meant, or if it changed anything at all, but for the first time she felt that whatever game Richard was playing, the rules had shifted, and perhaps, just perhaps, so had he. The final night of the week carried with it an air of celebration. The restaurant was fully booked, each table adorned with flickering candles and fresh white roses. The golden light from the chandeliers pooled over the room like warm honey, reflecting in the polished silverware and crystal glasses. A soft murmur of conversation rose and fell in harmony with the live piano, and the rich aroma of roasted lamb and freshly baked bread filled the air. Yet for her, there was a quiet undercurrent of curiosity. What, if anything, had shifted after her conversation with Richard Blackwell in the lounge? She moved through the evening with practiced grace, her hands steady, her smile warm, exchanging greetings with guests and small reassurances with staff. Richard was there, as always, in his usual corner. But tonight, there was something different in his presence. He seemed still. No calculated summons, no verbal traps, just silent observation. Midway through service, the maitre d' approached her with a subtle smile. "Mr. Blackwell has requested you personally for the head table." The words would once have carried the weight of a challenge, but tonight they felt more like an invitation. When she arrived, Richard stood. It was a simple act, but enough to draw glances from the nearby tables. He gestured to the guests, investors, community leaders, and patrons whose influence extended far beyond the restaurant's walls. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth but carrying a hint of something uncharacteristic, humility. "This is the young woman who has reminded me that service is not weakness, and dignity is not negotiable." The words landed softly, but in the silence that followed, they seemed to echo. For a moment, she simply stood there, caught between surprise and gratitude. She met his eyes, searching for the smirk, the calculated edge, but found only sincerity. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell," she replied, her voice calm, anchored by the quiet strength of Micah 6:8. "What does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God." She didn't speak the verse aloud, but it lived in the cadence of her tone, in the stillness of her posture. Applause rippled through the table, gentle but genuine. She stepped back into the flow of the dining room, the warm light catching on her uniform, the fragrance of fresh bread mingling with the cool night air drifting in from the entrance. Behind her, Richard resumed his seat, but the expression on his face lingered in her mind. Not a man conceding defeat, but one acknowledging a truth he hadn't expected to find. Long after the last guest had left and the lights had dimmed, she paused at the door, looking back at the now empty tables. It struck her that this night, in all its quiet significance, would be remembered, not because of who Richard Blackwell was, but because of what he had chosen to say. And in that thought she found a peace that would carry her far beyond these walls. Long after the night had ended, and the city lights had blurred into the horizon, the memory of those moments lingered like the faint glow of embers in a hearth. What had begun as a clash between authority and humility had unfolded into something deeper, a quiet reminder that strength isn't measured in dominance, but in steadfastness. In a place where fear had once been currency, she had chosen a different form of wealth, grace. Richard Blackwell remained a man of influence, a corporate mogul whose name still carried weight in boardrooms and headlines. But within the walls of that restaurant, on that night, he had been something else, a man willing to acknowledge the power of dignity. For her, it wasn't a victory to be celebrated loudly, but a confirmation that even the smallest acts, when rooted in faith, can echo further than we ever imagine. She would remember the way the air felt still as she spoke, the way Scripture had risen unbidden in moments of challenge, and the way hearts, even the most guarded, can be moved by truth spoken in kindness. It wasn't about changing Richard Blackwell. It was about standing unshaken, knowing that the foundation she stood on could not be moved. And perhaps that's the lesson we're meant to carry, that courage often looks like quiet persistence, that hope shines brightest in rooms shadowed by fear, and that the light we carry is never ours alone. As Matthew 5:16 reminds us, "Let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." If you've ever faced a moment where the easy path was to stay silent, but you chose to stand, no matter how small the stand seemed, then you know the truth of this story. Share it. Let it encourage someone else who feels unseen or unheard. And remember, sometimes the most memorable victories are the ones won in silence.